Whilst the embassy of the Yemen is located in one of London's most premier areas, back at home people are forced to put up with grinding poverty and growing corruption. But what does the impact of Yemen's faltering economy have on internal politics?
To the extent to which the Yemeni government loses control of territory, loses an ability to control extremist groups, to that extent, Yemen is a national interest of countries like the UK.
If there could be a greater al-Qaeda foothold in Yemen, that could form a partnership with those in Somalia, which is just over the Gulf of Aden, where al-Shabaab, of course, are challenging the American-backed government in Somalia.
It's a new colonial way. Rather than being there physically, it's to have your puppets and control them by the remote control from Washington.
Familiar scenes since the dawning of the Arab Spring. Angry protesters demand the removal of a long-standing autocrat. And the world looks on, unsure as what change might bring with it. Yet this is Yemen, and for a long time the world had paid scant attention. Dr. George, why do we know so little about Yemen?
Well, I think for a good 50 to 100 years, Yemen has been very much a backwater for the West. It used to be, of course, a critical point on the British route to the empire, particularly in India. Aden was a vital fueling stop. It was a link to the Suez Canal, another part of that route. But with the end of the British Empire, with the increasing reliance on air travel simply to go from west to east, it's lost a lot of its strategic significance to the West. Its importance today, in a sense, is that it happens to be adjacent to Saudi Arabia, which produces a great deal of oil and is a very close Western ally. Yemen itself is one can only use the word underdeveloped. It's a highly underdeveloped country. It's a very poor country. The infrastructure is still very poor. It's very tribal, mountainous, a large part of the country, and so the inland areas in particular are very inaccessible. And Yemen has tended to look in on itself rather than look out.
In recent years, I mean, certainly for the more than 3 decades, Yemen has been run by a president, Ali Abdullah Saleh, who was basically a friend to the West. Prior to that, Yemen was in the news. Aden was a British protectorate. There was a battleground between the West and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. So, you know, Yemen used to be in the news. But once there was, in a sense, a friendly dictator in power, it ceased to be relevant to much of the Western media.
And the protests in Yemen have focused on this man, Ali Abdullah Saleh, the unelected president since 1978. Saleh has presided over the poorest country in the Middle East, often promising reforms and economic progress, and then failing to deliver on either. The people of Yemen have suffered from an increasing lack of financial security, and the country's huge level of corruption have only served to increase both the hardship endured by the people and the anger towards its government.
الأسعار كما يقولون الأسعار العالمية ارتفعت وكذا وكذا، ولكن به بعض المبالغة في هذا الشيء. إذا غلي الحاجة في الخارج سنت أو 2 سنت، عندنا يغلى أكثر من 15 سنت أو 20 سنت. استغلال للغلاء العالمي على حساب المواطن الذي بيكد من أجل لقمة العيش.
الحركة الاقتصادية باليمن بشكل عام كلها يعني راكدة، ما فيش السوق زي ما كان من أول، والشراء والناس يعني أصبحت يعني كل واحد يعني يريد الحاجة بأرخص الأسعار.
الأعمال الإرهابية التي تقوم بها القاعدة والحرب مع الحوثي هذه تستنزف موارد الشعب وتضر بالاقتصاد، وهذا واضح ولمسناه من الآن، ونخشى من المستقبل أن تتطور الأمور حتى تفقد الدولة السيطرة عليها.
What do we know about the country's economic situation? Why is it so poor?
Well, there are many reasons linked. Yemen has, I should say, some oil, not very much, but a significant quantity. There's thought to be more. And exploration, of course, is accompanied by hopes in that area. But essentially, it's an agricultural country, but without major cash crops. The real pillar of the Yemen economy is actually the export of labour, in particular to neighbouring Saudi Arabia. So remittances sent home by Yemenis working abroad is what really keeps the country going.
But most of what the British press would have known about Yemen comes from the underwear bomber. Is that a fair assessment, that the place is too complex for us to report on it? A young man who studied there for a year once.
Absolutely right. But it did bring home the interrelationship of the situation in Yemen and national security of Western states. If Yemen, to the extent to which the Yemeni government loses control of territory, loses an ability to control extremist groups, to that extent, Yemen is a national interest of countries like the UK.
How so? What kind of impact could what happens in Yemen have here in the UK?
Well, simply, if it's going to be turned into a breeding ground for terrorists, anti-Western terrorists, then it's a simple equation. Terrorists will emerge from Yemen or be supported, enabled by groups in Yemen who will attack in the West itself. For about the past year, and particularly since the underwear bomber, of course, the British government, other Western governments have understood this, and they've understood that one of the major causes of instability in Yemen is the economic weakness, and to that extent they've committed aid money, which is significant, as well as committing to security cooperation.
Does this complexity explain why the British media are very slow in reporting news from Yemen?
I think when it comes to a country like Yemen, they're not really quite sure what that means, and there are several red flags that are raised. And you also have Al-Qaeda's presence there, which the United States keeps drawing attention to, that Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is based in Yemen. And of course, they've been involved in one or two celebrated and highly newsworthy events recently. For example, the bombing, the attempted bombing of the plane over Detroit a few Christmases ago, and also the sending of bombs on printers. So these kind of things have brought a great deal of attention to Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, not least the fact that several people who speak very good English are based in Yemen for Al-Qaeda. And that frightens the United States, because they believe that these people might have a greater influence over Muslims in the United States who feel angry about American foreign policy.
Of course, Yemen's relative obscurity on the international stage was shattered on Christmas Day 2009 by this man. Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalib, who had studied in the Yemeni capital Sanaa in 2004 and 2005, had returned in 2009. Having disowned his family and made contact with extremists in the area, Abdul Muttalib became involved in a plot to down an Airbus destined for Detroit. The plot failed due to the faulty nature of the explosives, but succeeded in putting this impoverished nation on the map. The vast expanses of uninhabited land, twinned with high levels of poverty, have made a fertile land for extremists. Yet given the strategic importance of the country to both Saudi Arabia and America, how has Al-Qaeda been able to establish itself so successfully? What role does Yemen play for Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. We hear a lot about it being a breeding ground, but break that down for us. Is it true? To what extent is it true? And what's being done about it?
Well, in a nutshell, yes, it's true. But again, it comes back to the very nature of Yemen. It has to be understood the extent to which Yemen is a coalition, an extremely loose coalition of tribes, basically, where the writ of the government does not extend and never has extended throughout much of the national territory, where the essential socio-political units are the tribes and the clans. So if you find a clan leader who's sympathetic to Islamism in the broadest sense, then it's not that difficult for armed elements, Al-Qaeda, to get a foothold in particular pieces of territory at a very local level.
Expand on this idea of Al-Qaeda in Yemen. Is this a recent phenomenon? Why is Yemen such fertile ground for Al-Qaeda?